All right, here we go. We'll get started. All right, before we do get started, we're going to ask Brother Jim back there if he'll lead us in a word of prayer.
Holy Father, thank you for today, for beautiful sunshine. Thank you for good health we enjoy, opportunities you set before us. Thank you that we come together on days such as this, study your word. Thank you, dear God, for your word. Please guide and direct. We ask your blessings upon Brother Rick as he presents the facts to us. Bless us as students thereof. We might increase our faith and become better servants of thine. In Jesus' name we pray.
All right. Like I say, we've made it over here to chapter 9. And what we're doing in chapter 9, chapters 9 through 11, Paul kind of changes gears here. And up to this point, what he's been talking about is salvation depending on obedience to the gospel plan of salvation. Of course, anytime you study a text, a book, or anything, whether you're studying in the Old Testament or the New Testament, you have an overall context or an overall theme. And of course, studying in the book of Romans, the overall context and theme is, how is a person justified in the sight of God? And we can go to Romans chapter 1, and I think, at least in my view, the theme or the thesis statement can be found in Romans 1, 16 and 17. And you all wrote a little bit of a paper on that, those taking this for credit. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. To gain salvation, you have to gain it through the gospel. And so up to this point, Paul's been talking about that, and he's been addressing that. So what he's going to do now, he's going to kind of move in a little bit of a different direction. And he's going to start talking about how the Jewish people, God has, in essence, cast that nation aside. And they're no longer His people. But before he does that, he's going to bring up some of the positives that they had and that they enjoyed as God's people. And he's doing that because of His great love and compassion for them. After all, what was Paul? He was a Jew, right? I mean, he understands from where they're coming. And he understands what a great hurdle this is. And if he has any hope of converting the Jewish nation or any of the folks in the Jewish nation, he can't just go in there and, with guns blazing, so to speak, and start telling them, well, you're done for, forget it. I mean, that's not the proper way to go about trying to convert anyone, is it? And so that is one of the applications I think we ought to make here and apply when we try to convert folks, okay? And so in chapter 9, he begins to state, and he does it in a very clear way, God rejected Israel. And He did it because they rejected His Son. They rejected the Messiah. He's not sugarcoating the sins they committed. He's not sugarcoating their obstinance. They were a stubborn people, and that's their history. Their history of being a stubborn people. When you sit through Brother Jim's history class, Jewish History 1 and 2, and you learn about them. It's just one mistake right after the other of being obstinate towards God. And so he begins to do that. And he talks about choosing the choices he made, and that he has a right to do that. And so he is setting up this, and he's kind of, it's not that he's sugarcoating or unnecessarily softening the blow, but he is pointing out to them the blessings of being a Jewish people. So the statement of verse 1, what we see here, he's forming a strong affirmation of the truthfulness. He is stating that I'm not lying. My conscience is stating and telling you it's a part of me that I have a deep concern for the nation of Israel. And he mentions his conscience. Of course, A person's conscience is the part that approves or disapproves of the way we live. But can our conscience always be our guide? No, it cannot. It depends on what we believe in, right? What have we founded our lives upon? What have we chosen to live for? Well, Paul is the example of that, isn't he? He stood before the Sanhedrin council and he told them, I've always lived in good conscience toward God. And until prior to his conversion, he was a murderer and a terrorist, and he killed Christians. But he did know within himself that he had a true feeling for the Jews. And he makes that statement in verse 1. And then he says in verse 2, the truth he affirmed was his great concern for Israel, verses 2 and 3. Now, what's the fact of the matter, though? The fact of the matter is the majority or most of Israel had rejected the Christ. They were going to continue to reject the gospel, and that was a source of sorrow for Paul. He was always going to be sorry for that. He wanted them to be saved, and that is another application that we have as Christians. That's a sorrowful feeling for us anytime that we see people live in disobedience to God. That's not something we enjoy. Brother Joel talked about that tonight in the sense of when we see people getting what they got coming to them. Right? That's not a Christian attitude. We want to see people repent. We want to see them turn toward God. And Paul made the statement that if he could, he would lose his own soul. He would condemn himself, right? But he couldn't make that wish because he knows God is not going to condemn a person for someone else. He's not going to allow a person to go to heaven for another individual. Okay? That's not within the plan, the system of faith plan. And that's what this whole book is about. That's the overall context. And so God would never allow that. And so Paul understands he could not wish for that. But if he could, he said he would. But the point that he's making there is his sincerity. He wants the Jewish people to understand his sincerity and his love for them because there was an issue between Paul and the Jews, right? They hated Paul. They hated Paul as much probably as they hated the Lord. Because how did they look at Paul? What did they view him as? Some sort of a traitor, didn't they? Traitor to his own people. And so that hurt Paul. He wanted them to be saved. So before discussing the Jews and their loss of standing before God as his people, he begins to name some of the advantages. First of all, he calls them Israelites. Well, that means Prince of God, and that indicates the standing that Jacob had. Well, if Jacob had this particular standing, who else would have that standing? Well, everyone that came after Jacob, right? His descendants, they would have that standing. He said that the adoption pertained to Israel. Of every nation on earth, God chose Israel. He didn't choose them because they were this great nation. He didn't choose them because they were necessarily a great people. He simply chose them to be his special people. Their sonship, their being children of God, that was on a national level. But here's the thing, though. Just because you were born into the family of God, that didn't guarantee your eternal security. There were still rules and regulations you had to follow, right? You could be a disobedient Jew. So you had to follow God's laws. And that is what they ended up missing, wasn't it? They ended up missing that. The prophet told them, said, well, God can raise up these rocks to be descendants of Abraham. You have to be obedient. So they still had to be obedient. Glory pertained to them. And there was something glorious about Israel. There was something very glorious. And one of the greatest blessings that had to do with Israel was that they had God's law. The only nation that had God's law. He entrusted them with those oracles. And when we think of God's glory, God manifested His glory in many ways, right? When they were traveling through the wilderness, you saw it in a cloud during the day as He led them. You saw it in a pillar of fire at night. We recall when Moses came down off of Mount Sinai after having received the Decalogue. How did it manifest His glory then? His face, right? He had to wear a veil. It scared the people. They didn't even want to come close to Moses. So His glory was manifest. What other nation had that? Well, no other nation had that relationship. It was a glorious nation. To Israel pertained to the covenants. Of course, that was the covenant. There were several covenants that God had made with Israel. The old covenant, the law itself, that was the covenant. The covenant of circumcision. The promises that were made to Abraham that went on down through to Isaac, to Jacob, to the descendants. No other nation had that. And of course, Paul says to them pertained the giving of the law. There was a wonderful blessing that came along with having that law, that none of the nations had that. All they had was that sense of ought. They knew right and wrong. They had that. They had what was written in their hearts. They had that universal law, but they did not have that special law, the oracles of God, that were given directly to God's people, Deuteronomy chapter 5. They didn't have, no one else had that. So we're seeing, and Paul is pointing out, that it's an amazing relationship that God had with that nation of people. And in fact, Paul had already mentioned in chapter 3 of this book, the chief advantage that the Jews had was they had been given that law. He mentions the blessing of the service of God pertained to Israel. Of course, that refers to the ceremonies and the rites and all those things that were prescribed in this law we're mentioning. And, of course, the Gentiles, they didn't have a system that referred to any of those things or that had those types of things in relation to God. But here's something else. Again, just because you were born into the family of God, you still had to follow those services of God in a very particular way, didn't you? You had to do it properly. The priests had to carry out those things. Just anyone couldn't go into the temple and carry out those things that God had prescribed to be done. What happened if someone, if you did it improperly? What happened if you went and got fire from the wrong place to offer incense or burn incense? What happened to you? Well, you might just get fire come down from heaven and burn you alive, right? That might happen. Absolutely, and Brother Bill makes the point that we can see and understand and why they would get puffed up and why they would become prideful. And see, brethren, that's exactly why Paul is coming at this the way he's coming at it here in chapter 9. He's mentioning all these things, and he said, you had this, you had that. And then he mentions the promises. Of course, that's extended to Abraham on down through the descendants. The nations didn't have that directly through Abraham, but it would be extended to all the people, right? Now they didn't, or they failed to catch on to that, right? They overlooked that little nugget of information. Because that promise included the Messiah. It included His spiritual kingdom. It included the church. Then he mentioned the fathers, the forebears, the Jewish people. They were, they were very respectful and had a deep pride when they looked back on those men. And when we talk about the fathers, we're obviously talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, on down through David, Solomon, all those men. And who did the Gentiles have that they could even come close to mentioning to those men that were revered? No, they didn't have that. He says, through whom the flesh of Christ came. Well, Jesus entered into the history of humanity at a particular point in time. So the man, Jesus, wasn't eternal. The Word, the second person of the Godhead, has always been in existence. Okay? Has always been eternal. No beginning, no ending. When Christ, when Jesus came into the world, when the Word took upon Himself flesh and became the man Jesus, John 1 verse 14, He didn't empty Himself of one bit of deity. You can't become less God or more God. You are just God. But it was through the Jews that the fleshly body of God came into the world. And what a great blessing that was. So it was a fact that most Jews would reject the Christ, though, as the Messiah. But despite their rejection, God made Jesus both Lord and Christ, both the Messiah. And they had to understand that. And that's why Paul's going about this the way he went about it. They had to come to terms with that. And so he's going at it with the best possible way to get them to understand. You had this wonderful relationship, and you missed, or you chose to overlook, you hardened your hearts at all the prophecies. Now let's get down and understand some things here. And we'll get to verses 6 through 13 here, and he begins to talk about the lineage of Christ. And he mentions some very important things here. And he begins with talking about how God is always true. He always fulfills His promises. Any promise God has ever made, He has fulfilled it. But what is the thing that we know true to be about any promise God makes? God never makes just a blanket promise that says, I will do this, period. He's never done that. It's always conditional, isn't it? It's always conditional. I'm going to send you into the promised land, and you will stay there forever if you do this. Well, obviously, they didn't fulfill the if, right? And so that's the thing about that. But God is always true to His Word. If He weren't true to His Word, then He wouldn't be God. That's the thing about that, right? Now, Israel believed that the old system was the end all to God's plan. It was not. It was not. So therein, their argument to Paul was, well, if the old law was not the end all to God's plan, then He didn't keep His promise. And so that's how Paul is going at this argument. He says that's not true. Just because you do not believe in the Messiah doesn't mean that God's not keeping His promises. The reason they didn't believe in the Messiah was He didn't match up or fit their expectation of what the Messiah should be. What they wanted was someone to ride into Jerusalem and was a mighty warrior and to establish a physical kingdom. It was never to be a physical kingdom. It was never prophesied to be a physical kingdom, and they just weren't paying attention. And so God's plan always was to offer the blessings that He had to the world through the church for which the Messiah would die. Prophecies were made to that end, but they failed to take them into proper account. They didn't pay attention to that. And in Acts chapter 2, we learn that Peter even explained to them that David wasn't talking about himself, was he? David wasn't talking about himself in the tomb. David's still there. And in fact, somewhere, David's bones are still in the tomb, aren't they? Unless someone's robbed them, they're still somewhere. But the Lord is not. He was speaking of Jesus, the Christ. Now, what is the case today is we have premillennialists and even Jews today. They're still looking for some kind of a physical fulfillment to God's promise for an earthly kingdom, but they don't understand. They don't get it. God already fulfilled that promise. In addition, God did not, and Paul makes, and this is one of his points, God didn't choose all of Abraham's descendants, did he, to form the nation of Israel. Didn't Abraham have other children? In fact, Isaac wasn't even his first child. There was this fellow running around called Ishmael. And Sarah tried to run them off a couple times, and they were brought back. But Ishmael wasn't the son of promise. Isaac was the son of promise. So Paul is making the point, and we're going to notice even more, was God righteous in choosing Isaac over Ishmael? Well, sure he was. So just because you can claim a fleshly kinship to Abraham, that doesn't mean you're the seed of Abraham. Your fleshly kinship isn't going to automatically give you citizenship in the kingdom. You have to be obedient. You have to do what God asked. So God was righteous in choosing Isaac over Ishmael, just as he is righteous in choosing Christ over the nation of Israel in the Christian age. God is righteous. What Paul's getting to here, what the ultimate point is, don't question God. You were all for him choosing Isaac over Ishmael, but now you want to change your attitude and say, well, God's not righteous. He's not righteous for rejecting Israel. No, he is righteous, and you can't question him. That's the ultimate point that he wants to get here. But verse 8 explains that more clearly. There were more descendants than just Isaac, okay? And the Jews didn't have a right to complain. You can't complain because you were rejected over Christ, okay? There were, even after Ishmael, even after Isaac, Abraham married Keturah. They had children. They weren't chosen, okay? We get down to verse 9, and that tells us how Isaac was the son of promise, how God would visit Sarah, make it possible for her to conceive. Isaac wouldn't even be a possibility if God had not, through a miraculous means, made it possible for Sarah to conceive. So it must have been that Sarah was obviously beyond the childbearing age, and because later on Abraham continued to have children, so God made that possible. But it wasn't a miraculous birth like the Christ, because Abraham and Sarah still had to come together as husband and wife. But here's something else that they bring up. And what Paul's doing here, he is anticipating questions. Okay? Someone says, well, what about later on? What about Jacob and Esau? And the idea is, when we look in verse, was it 10 and 11 here? 10 and 11. The idea is, well, you might make that point when you're talking about Isaac, because Ishmael wasn't the true son of Abraham and Sarah. But now, when we look at Isaac having children, Jacob and Esau, they were the true children of Rebekah and Isaac. And so we have an issue, so they might be able to have an argument. So what Paul's doing here, Paul's making the point, God made significant choices in the past, and he later on also made significant choices just simply because he's God. and he can make choices. And that's the point he's making. Okay, we have to understand that. God makes choices because he's God. He makes choices based on his wisdom. He makes choices based on his power. He doesn't have to counsel with the people involved. Okay? And that's the point. They're saying, well, he made the choice because Ishmael wasn't really Abraham and Sarah's true son. Well, no. He made that choice because he wanted to make that choice. And so now we look at Esau and Jacob. He made that choice before those boys were even born, because Paul says he made it before they even ever did right or wrong. He made the choice. It didn't have anything to do with those boys individually as far as decisions they made in this life. It was a decision God made based on his wisdom for the benefit of the people. That's the point Paul's making. God had a right to make that decision based on his wisdom and his power. So if he has the right to do that, he has the right to say, I choose Christ in the system, the gospel system, over the old system in the Jewish nation, because I choose it for the benefit of the people. Does that make sense? And you do not have the right to question God, because he's God. You liked it when he chose Isaac, but now all of a sudden you don't like it. Too bad. That's basically what the idea is. You don't have the right to question God. Now, the decision he made, though, had no effect on those individual children and their eternal destiny. God wasn't choosing, and Calvinists like to use these passages to say, well, he chose and that affected their eternal destiny. That did not affect their eternal destiny. This only pertained to the destiny of Israel as a nation. It did not affect these children individually as far as their choices to be righteous or unrighteous. They did that on their own. This was purely pertaining to Israel as a nation. Okay? Now, I put this in your notes just as a side. This completely destroys the false doctrine of original sin. You're not born sinful, because Paul makes that clearly argument in this passage, because he made the choice between these two boys prior to them doing good or evil. Any comments? %. Yeah. And he touches on that even more in chapter 11. And Sister Carmen says, you know, the premillennialists teach he wasn't successful because he didn't establish his kingdom when he came. The premillennialists state that. And that's true. I don't want to follow a Lord who doesn't have the power to do, you know, if God's not powerful enough to do what he intended to do, well, then we have a problem. No person can ever defeat God. And Paul's making, you know, and he's pointing toward that in these statements he's making right here. We don't even have a right to question God's decisions in the choices he makes. So we get to verses 12 and 13. And the message in 12 and 13 was actually given to Rebekah at that birth, but it's immediately understood, and it's talking about the younger or the elder serving the younger, speaking of Jacob and Esau. But now that is only true, and it regards the descendants of Jacob and Esau. Esau was never in subjection to Jacob. Those two men. In fact, Jacob feared Esau, didn't he? When they met after their separation for many years, Jacob feared Esau. But it was true of their descendants. Israel did bring Edom at one time into subjection. Now, the second statement that we read in this passage, verses 12 and 13, was not part of the message given to Rebekah. It's an Old Testament statement found in Malachi 1 through 3. And it was recorded about 1,400 years after the death of both of these men. Jacob I loved, yet Esau I hated. And we need to understand that in view of love and hate in the Scripture. Okay? God hates no human being in that he has ill will toward a human being. Okay? It's in the same way, unless you hate father and mother, you can't follow me, Christ said. It's to love less or to show more love for. So what he's talking about here in this passage is that God expressed a greater love for Jacob by choosing him, through which he would develop the nation of Israel, through which the Messiah would come. Because that's a great honor, because we just talked about all the wonderful things that Israel enjoyed as a special people and a special relationship that they had with God. So that's showing a greater love that he demonstrated. Not that he didn't love Esau. He loved Esau as much as he loved any of his creation. But he showed a greater love, or a greater, what's the word I'm looking for? Fondness for, maybe. Or respect, maybe you might say. I don't know, what word am I looking for, Brother Jim? Maybe a preference for him, because in his wisdom he knew the kind of people they were going to be. I think preference probably is a good idea, or a proper word. Because in his wisdom he knew what type of person Esau would be. He knew what type of person Jacob would be. And he preferred, and he chose Jacob. Through him the lineage would come. So he didn't hate Esau by any stretch of the imagination that we understand the word hate. So when we get here to verses 14 through 18, we see God's righteousness with Israel. What we're going to notice here, a Jew confronted with this reality of the rejection of their nation, they're going to likely raise the objection found in verse 14. Is God unrighteous? Or God is unrighteous? And of course, we're going to see this common answer. Paul denied the accusation. He said, God forbid. Now, again, the most avid Jew would admit God was not unrighteous in choosing Jacob over Esau. And so he ought to be able to understand God's righteousness in rejecting Israel over Christ. Now, is he going to see that? No, obviously he's not. But here's the problem. The Jew did not fully know or understand the Old Testament Scripture, because if he had, he would have realized God's plan for replacing the old law. He would have understood all the prophecies, the messianic prophecies. He would have recognized Jesus for who he was when he showed up, when he began to demonstrate his power, when he was preaching the message of the coming kingdom. There are just too many prophecies that were being fulfilled at that time. Too many prophecies referring to his sacrifice, his resurrection, his ascension to heaven. So they were self-willed, they were ignorant, or they were foolish. Maybe all the above. So whose fault was it? Was it God's fault? Was God unrighteous? No. It was their fault. It's never God's fault. When we look at verse 14, Paul is quoting Exodus 33:19. And it states God's intention of showing mercy to whomsoever he will, and that's been misapplied. That people who misapply that intend that God just arbitrarily is going to be merciful to Reggie and be unmerciful to Bill for whatever reason, however he wakes up and feels today. Well, that's not proper. God is merciful to whom He will and unmerciful to whom He will, meaning that no one is going to prevent God from being merciful to those who are obedient, no matter if you dislike the Gentile or not, coming from the aspect of the Jew. If you want the disobedient to have mercy, it makes no difference. If you want them to have it or not, God is going to be merciful according to His directives. And now, in the context of Exodus 33, God is encouraging a discouraged Moses. Okay? Because he's discouraged because the people are faithless, they're disobedient, and Moses isn't really understanding why God isn't just giving them the full dose of punishment they deserve. And because he doesn't really understand God's full plan for Israel at that point, because none of the prophets really understood God's plan. They looked into it just as the angels did. They would have liked to have known, but they didn't. And so God is trying to encourage Moses, okay, in his moment of discouragement. But people misuse that statement when they should not. Verse 16 is certainly not teaching individuals don't have free will or choice. It is within the context of what Paul's been discussing. God makes the choices, and He chose the ancestral line for the Messiah. In further confirmation, Paul used the illustration of Pharaoh. Who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Well, God hardened it, but what was the reasoning? That it was because of demands that God made, right? God demanded Pharaoh do what he said because he had a right to demand it. And Pharaoh said, I'm not going to do it. Who is this God that I ought to listen to him? So, in essence, where it says, God, I'm going to harden his heart, Pharaoh hardened his own heart because he refused to obey God. And that's the problem. And well, yeah, Pharaoh's in power because he was going to use him for a purpose. And just like all nations who disobey God, he was going to punish him. He was in power because he was going to send his people down there for about 400 years so they could learn to be a nation. And they were going to learn to be to work together under difficult situations. And then when it was time to leave, Pharaoh could have released them. Moses showed up and he said, God says, let my people go. What should Pharaoh have done? Let those people go, and they would have left Egypt and they would have headed toward the promised land. Now, God's people would have done what God's people always did, disobeyed him. But Pharaoh would have been off the hook, wouldn't he? But that wasn't going to happen. And so Pharaoh disobeyed God, and he paid the price for it. But a person's heart is hardened or softened according to his own reaction to the Word of God, verse 18. So basically that's what happened, right? It happened back in Egypt. It happens today in our own world. When we look at the sovereignty, for just the next couple of minutes before we take a break, the sovereignty and the patience of God, verses 19 through 29, Paul anticipated another question in verse 19. Why does he find fault with us? We haven't resisted God. Well, that's not a shock or a surprise to anyone that the Jews would ask that. I put in the notes, that sounds like someone who would say, well, God knows my heart. They don't want to be obedient, but they'll tell you, well, God knows my heart. He knows how I am. Yes, He does. He does know that. Yeah, exactly. And the idea here is the people are saying, well, we're not like Pharaoh. We're not hardening our hearts. Well, yeah, because Israel very rarely ever obeyed God, didn't they? And we look back over their history, how often were they faithful to God in obedience? Well, very seldom. Very seldom. They weren't known for that, right? And so Paul anticipated that they did not consider rejecting God, or rejecting the gospel as resisting God. We'll take a break right here for.
People say, well, the devil knows my weaknesses.
No, he doesn't. You show the devil your weaknesses. That's correct. All right, we'll come back in 10.